Pull out a few too many papers there, Makai. Mm-hmm. Did you find the timeline you're looking for?
I did.
Good. All right, so I suggest you keep your timeline and the genealogy I handed out handy as we go through this today.
It's this one, right?
Yep.
So can we just name like the first Ahaziah, like Ahaziah 1 and the second Ahaziah?
No, we're not going to do that. I've never seen anybody do that, so I'm not going to introduce something new, novel that'll only ever take place here. So I think one of them has a couple of variations to his name that I listed on the timeline. Up on the northern kingdom, we have a Jehoram, who could also be known as Joram. And then, in the southern kingdom of Judah, Ahaziah is also sometimes known as Jehoahaz, and apparently Azariah in one place or another. So variations of names can make this more challenging. Nebuchadnezzar had about 10 or 12 different names that are ascribed to him in the ancient historical texts, and everybody today just simplifies it down to Nebuchadnezzar, but like he had an insane number of names.
Isn't
And
Nebuchadnezzar technically a title though, too?
Kind of, yeah. And then his son or grandson is really controversial because he had about 10 different names that were ascribed to him. It's just whoever the last king of Babylon was, the fall of Babylon usually ends up being the same story, but the guy always has a different name. So this is a problem that historians run into, and we run into it in the Bible too, because in the Chronicles account, the names don't always align with what we have in the King's account. But the stories align. Oftentimes the name means the same thing, or you have an apparent nickname. Through the course of my life, I've had many nicknames. My mother nicknamed me DJ, and then my sisters modified that because I had a foul mood from time to time when I was 4 years old, and they changed it to DJ Grumpus. J is because my middle name is John. And then later in college, they called me DG because they didn't know my middle name, but they knew my last name, so they just grabbed that initial. And other times I was just known as George, and other times I was just known as the curly-haired religious kid.
Yes.
I was in high school, and
I really hope that gets applied to me.
maybe it will someday, who knows. Anyhow, so people have different names, and sometimes they get remembered more by a nickname than their actual name. So like William Jefferson Clinton, who was he known for? Right.
Wait.
He was a
his-
president, exactly. So if you find an official document, it will say William Jefferson Clinton, the 42nd or something president of the United States, and everybody's like, William who? What? I never voted for someone like that, but it's just like, oh, it's Bill. Anyhow, we have these issues in historical documents too. All right, so we're still in the divided monarchy. We still have several weeks left in this phase. Eventually, we will get to the exile.
Eventually.
It might be April. It will be before May, though. All right, so we covered Jeroboam's dynasty and Baasha's dynasty. Last week was Super Bowl Sunday, and I shouldn't have even planned on having anything, and it was a good day to have off anyway. Tonight we're doing Omri's dynasty. Next week we'll do Jehu's dynasty, and it gets really messy after that point. There is one father-son pairing, but the son dies so fast it's hard to call it a dynasty, and there's so many independent guys. But anyway, we will look at the end of the Northern Kingdom on March 5th. That will be when we have our pineapple competition. And then the 12th and the 19th are spring break in the BW district, and one of those is the Truebridge Youth Retreat. So those 2 Sundays will be off. And I'll have a new calendar next week so everybody can see how this goes through the rest of the spring.
So are we gonna have like 2 weeks worth of readings and whatnot?
Mm-hmm.
You're not supposed to eat all that chocolate tonight
What?
in 20 minutes. You should see the
Just
refuse pile.
just make sure the wrappers get dealt with. We had him do his cardio already tonight, so
Oh,
he
so
can,
he's good?
yeah, he should
He's
be
not
good.
gonna go crazy.
No, I won't.
No.
Just a convert.
Alright.
Exactly. That's the
All right. So the dynasty of Omri is the northern kingdom of Israel. Capital city starts in Tirzah. Omri moves it to Samaria. We have a lot of people reigning off of this dynasty, which are all listed on that timeline, or not the timeline, they're on the timeline. They're also on the genealogy there. Omri reigns for 12 years, 929 to 918 BC. He's not that famous in pop Bible culture. Ahab is much more famous
Yes.
because he interacted with Elijah. Ahab reigns for 22 years, which goes from 918 to 897.
Wait, are Tears and Samaria the same thing?
Nope,
He moved it from.
he
Tirzah to
moved
Tirzah.
it. Yep, that's one of the accomplishments of Omri. We'll come back to that. Ahab's son Ahaziah got the throne. He actually overlaps his rule a little bit with his father.
Dual kingmanship?
Yep, co-regency is what they call it.
Okay.
So he actually started reigning just a little before Ahab was killed in battle. Kings would do this oftentimes to get the right son poised to take the throne. David did this with Solomon. They only had a 6-month overlap. Ahab and Ahaziah had a little longer overlap. Ahaziah dies in battle quite quickly, and his brother takes the throne because he didn't have a son at this point.
That's right.
So this is another son of Ahab, Jehoram. He reigns a good deal longer, about 12 years. And then their sister, Athaliah, becomes queen in Judah for 6 years, 884 to 878.
So all 3 of his kids.
3 of his kids rule the kingdom for a little while, but none of them at the same time.
She's missing on my timeline.
She is in the southern kingdom, down below, and we'll actually cover her reign more next week.
Oh, I found it.
Yep. But she's in this dynasty, so I have her listed here. All that information's on the timeline and also in the genealogy. We good to go forward?
No.
No? Okay.
Is she the first queen?
Only queen. Mhm. Only queen between the 2 kingdoms. Mhm.
Right.
Which also means she was the first.
Yep. Alright.
Wait, I need to just see when she goes.
Okay.
There's just technically how many she's.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So first one is Omri. Remember, this overlaps a little bit with the end of Baasha's dynasty because Omri was the commander of the army besieging Gibbethon of the Philistines when Elah, the son of Baasha, was assassinated. Omri's army declares him king. There's civil war with Tibni for 4 years. Then Tibni, son of Ginath, is defeated. Remember, the palace in Tirzah gets burned to the ground. This might have something to do with why Omri moves the capital to Samaria.
Probably.
Probably has a lot to do with it. Because it was just 2 years later that he began ruling from Samaria, which is a city that he built.
Yeah.
Still in the tribe of Ephraim. I'm not sure if it's on your map. I want to get an improved map for you all next week, hopefully. But he reigns 6 years in Tirzah, 4 of which are during the Civil War, and 6 years in Samaria.
Do we know how he died?
Nope, we do not know how he died. He does not get much in scripture for anything, actually. His son gets a lot of chapters because he keeps interacting with the prophet Elijah. So we'll quickly move on to Ahab. So Ahab is a notorious king of Israel because he marries Jezebel, the daughter of the king of Sidon. And she introduces Baal worship to Ahab, and Ahab proceeds to then build a temple and an altar to Baal in Samaria.
Not good.
Very much not good. So you remember the sin of Jeroboam was calling Yahweh this calf god and having everybody worship this idol that he set up, one in Dan and one in Bethel.
I mean,
But they were still kind of following the law of Moses. It's just they had a graven image that they called Yahweh, essentially.
they were still technically worshiping Yahweh, though, in a sense.
Right. So Jezebel's like, let's introduce you guys to the pantheon of gods, and look at Baal. He's the storm god. Isn't he amazing? And they all start worshiping Baal, in addition to the Asherahs. So they build an Asherah pole, and all kinds of pagan worship gets introduced. And as if a note to almost to kind of exemplify how far the Israelites had fallen in their righteousness and in their zest to follow after God, somebody even rebuilt Jericho, which, if you remember, Joshua cursed, said, "Cursed be the man who rebuilds this city Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn, he will build its wall, lay the foundations. The cost of his youngest, put bars in the gates."
Oh my
And that
goodness.
guy is actually named, I think his name is Hiel, or something like that. And it says that his oldest and his youngest sons died.
What do you know? Those
Yep.
unfortunate sons.
But that's why Jesus goes through Jericho and meets Zacchaeus there, because otherwise it should have been a non-existent city. But it was existent once again.
He went
Good
through
days.
Jericho to meet Zacchaeus?
Yes, Jesus walked through Jericho. That's where he met Zacchaeus.
I've always wondered, like, it gets destroyed pretty thoroughly. Why is it back?
Yep, that's why it's back.
Wow.
Because in Ahab's day, the Israelites walked away from God that far that somebody ignored the curse of Joshua. So things don't actually go all that great in Ahab's reign. There's a famine for 3 years, and there is also a lot of war with Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram. You remember who it was that coaxed the Arameans to first attack the northern kingdom?
Yeah,
Wasn't
some
it
southern
Judah?
king.
Asa, the king of the south. Yep.
Oh yeah.
And the Arameans picked up a lot of territory, and that sparked this huge ongoing conflict between Aram and the northern kingdom of Israel through this entire dynasty. And so we're going to find wars going on with the Arameans for a long time, several generations, and it all goes back to Asa not following God, not trusting God to deliver him from the northern kingdom, and instead diplomatically coaxing the Arameans to attack.
Man, so Asa led to so much chaos.
Yes. So there is peace with Sidon, though, because they had the treaty formalized with the Jezebel's marriage to Ahab. And there's also peace with Judah, which was formalized in another marriage, which will come up a couple times here yet. So already move on to Ahab's demise. He reigns for 22 years. Towards the end of his reign, in a period of peace with Aram, he wants Naboth's vineyard, wants to buy it from him. Naboth says no, and he goes and sulks, and Jezebel does not get the ways of the Israelites and doesn't realize that you can't just take somebody's inheritance from them. She's more of the Eastern monarch, absolute monarch style, where if you want something and you're the king, you just take it. And so she conspires to get Naboth falsely accused and killed and takes the vineyard. Elijah comes and rebukes Ahab, and he says to Ahab, "Your house will become like that of Jeroboam's and Baasha's." You remember what happened to those houses?
Oh yeah.
Utter destruction.
Utter destruction. So this meant something huge to Ahab. And I think it says, anyone belonging to Ahab who dies in the city, dogs shall eat, and anyone who dies in the open country, the birds of the heavens shall eat.
Wasn't that said of Jeroboam
That's the third time this curse has been called down, or this judgment, so to speak. Judgment, not a curse. So this is the third time, and Ahab responds to this with an incredible amount of humility. He wears sackcloth and ashes because he recognizes this has teeth.
It's like it's happened twice before.
This has happened twice before. Elijah's really actually speaking from God. This is really bad news. And so God relents from sending it in Ahab's day and says, I'm going to send it in the days of his son.
Oh.
Hadn't Carmel already happened?
Yep, Carmel
So
had
he
already
knew-
happened.
He knew Elijah had a little bit of
Yes. So eventually God lost his patience with Ahab. Instead of destroying his entire house, he just needed to take out Ahab. And there's this battle at Ramoth Gilead, and this is like the front lines of the war between Aram and the northern kingdom of Israel. And at this point, Israel is allied with Jehoshaphat and Judah. If you remember, through the first two dynasties, there was constant war between the north and the south, and even through most of Asa's reign. And now all of a sudden, Judah and Israel are on the same side fighting a war against a common enemy, ironically the one that Asa provoked against the northern kingdom. Ahab goes into battle disguised, but he dies in battle with an arrow drawn at random, and this fulfills the word of the Lord spoken by the prophet Micaiah, who never sees the light of day again in Scripture.
You gotta think, what was the king of Judah thinking when he wore his when he was told to wear your robes? But I'm gonna go in disguise.
I don't know. There's a lot of times where you see Jehoshaphat and you're like, what were you thinking?
maybe he just didn't quite have something right in his head. Like,
It is entirely possible. There are so many things he did that's so good, and so many things is just like facepalm. I don't understand it. It does not make sense.
at least I'm not named after him.
Nope. All right. So for a while in 1 Kings, it seems as if the author totally digresses from the annals and the chronicles of the kings of Israel and Judah and is all about this account of Elijah the prophet. His ministry begins during Ahab's reign and it ends approximately 885 BC. I actually have that incorrectly on the timeline. As I was going through the Chronicles account, I realized it probably should be a little bit later, but it can't be precisely dated.
Oh.
But Elisha did start ministering at about the time frame that's on there. So that is a little bit more fuzzy than the timeline would imply.
So he's contemporary with Jehoram and
Yes,
Ahaziah.
Ahaziah, yep,
Barely.
barely. And the reason I know he's a little later is because in the Chronicles account, he sent a letter to a king of Judah who was not on the throne in 896 yet. So it had to be a little later. And anyhow, so some of the highlights from Elijah's ministry. He's the one who prophesies the famine into existence in Ahab's reign. And this is an example of prophetic forthtelling. We oftentimes think of prophets as foretelling the future. This is actually something where Elijah is calling something into being that was not. And this is the famine. Obviously, he's doing this at the word of the Lord. You can't call something forth that God isn't speaking forth. But in the same way that God said, let there be light, and he called forth light into existence, Elijah is speaking the word of the Lord, calling this famine into existence. And at the same time, he also calls the rain at the end of it into being. As another example of prophetic forthtelling, calling things forth that are not.
So do you reckon Elijah was like, yeah, I feel like we should have famine or whatever, like it just came to his mind, like, as he's like talking to Ahab?
No, I'm pretty sure he was inspired by the Holy Spirit. I don't think it was his judgment. Anyway, at the end of this famine, during the famine, he gets fed by ravens, and then he goes and lives with the widow of Zarephath, which is in Sidon, Israel being allied with Sidon during these days. Easy border to cross, probably more food over there. So he's not even in Israel for most of the famine. He's living with the widow in Zarephath. And she's not an Israelite. She is a Sidonian, according to Jesus in the New Testament. But then 3 years later, he confronts Ahab at Mount Carmel, prophets of Baal get destroyed, fire is called down from heaven, which I think is a euphemism for a lightning bolt, but I'm not absolutely positive on that.
Quite ironically.
Yes.
Being the Mukada.
Yes, Baal being the storm god, and he cannot call fire from heaven, but he can.
And if he's the
Be
storm
shown
god,
up.
the famine shows his weakness, because
Mhm.
you should be able to bring forth storms that can bring rain.
Yes.
Very symbolic.
Yes, there was a very symbolic famine. No rain except at Ahab's word for 3 years, or Elijah's word for 3 years. And they're worshiping the storm god of the Phoenicians in this day. So Elijah goes from a mountaintop experience at Mount Carmel to another mountaintop experience at Mount Horeb, where he had fled from Jezebel. And I'm pretty sure that this Mount Horeb is actually also known as Mount Sinai in other parts of the Bible.
So
Like this-
Baal had such a heavy false following. That false god had its own set of prophets?
400 prophets that were supported by Jezebel
Oh my
from the
God.
royal revenues. After Horeb, Elisha begins attending Elijah, and this is like his apprenticeship into becoming a prophet. Elijah also rebukes Ahab about Naboth of Jezreel, and he sends a letter of rebuke to Jehoram the king of Judah, and then at some point he gets taken to heaven in a whirlwind. Thus ends the ministry of Elijah.
Wasn't he one of only a few people that he was known?
One of two.
The other was.
Enoch
Yeah.
You know.
was not, and Elijah was not. So Ahaziah is the son of Ahab, the brother of Athaliah. He reigned alongside Ahab for about a year before Ahab dies. It says that he continued in the sin, the ways of Ahab and Jezebel, so he was worshiping the Baals and the Asherah. And he also followed in the ways of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, the calf god worship. Very shortly after his father dies, he falls through a lattice and injures himself. And this is another one of those famous Elijah incidents. So Ahaziah sends word to consult the god Baal-zebub of Ekron in the Philistines' land to find out if he's going to recover from this illness or not. Elijah intercepts the messengers on the road and sends a message back. Is there no God in Israel that you have to consult Baal-zebub in Ekron? So the messengers get back to Ahaziah way too fast and surprised him. And he sends 50 men to go apprehend Elijah. Fire burns them up. Another 50 men get sent. Fire burns them up. Another 50 men get sent. Their commander was much more humble. When you see the smoking ruin of 100 men lying before you, you tend to tread softly. So Elijah goes and speaks to Ahaziah that he will die from this disease, or not, this injury, and he does. So Ahaziah reigns just long enough to die, and he dies without a son. So his brother gets the throne.
So weren't the Philistines and Israel at war? Well, not basically.
Yeah, so this is interesting. So the Philistines were subjugated by David, but then they're at war with the Israelites of the northern kingdom several times, and it would seem as if the northern kingdom had subjugated them perhaps and were extracting tribute out of them, but didn't always have control of them. So
So it's
I
like
need to get a really good imperialistic map to show how this works, because like you conquer a territory, and whereas when Joshua came into the land of Canaan, it was just scorched earth extermination. If you beat the Edomites and subjugated them, you didn't destroy them all, you just extracted a lot of taxes
so
from
it's
them.
like taking territories in the castle game, except no one else here understands.
No one knows that, Micaiah. So the Philistines, for a while at least, seem to have been subjugated to the northern kingdom of Israel and not Judah, which
Interesting.
changes around. It ends up being mixes around a little bit, but yeah, the
I'm pretty
Philistines
sure
were still around.
Jeroboam was the character I asked about at the beginning.
Okay,
Okay.
he's the one who introduces the calf worship.
Yeah, but what confused me, when he initially introduced that, it was connected to God or it wasn't?
It was connected to God. He just put a graven image and put God's name on it.
That's
Said
gonna
you-
make God upset.
Yes. Said, this is your God that led you out of Egypt and crossed the Red Sea. And it's a calf. That made God a little upset. So Joram gets rid of the sacred stone of Baal. He's not worshiping the Asherahs, but he does continue in the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. So it's obviously not good, but when you're coming out of Ahab's reign and his son Ahaziah, this is actually a step back in the right direction. And he reigns a little bit longer.
What's Baal's sacred stone?
I'm not sure. You could research that for next week and tell us all about it, though.
I thought Baal was a Canaanite fertility god.
Sorry,
He might be. Say what?
Can you go back one slide, please?
Oh, yep.
Slide.
It's all right. There.
I remember that slide.
Yes. Yeah, there's lots of aspects and attributes to the various different Canaanite gods. So, storm god and fertility god, rain is what makes the ground grow food in abundance, and so there's associations there.
Okay, thank you.
Which means the worship ends up being very perverse. But all right. So Moab had been subjugated by the northern kingdom of Israel. When Ahab dies, they see an opportunity to throw off the yoke of Israel, and so they rebel and revolt. Joram, once he establishes himself on the throne, tries to re-subjugate them. And this is a really fun chapter in the scriptures because of some of the historical connections that we can make from this passage. So as we see from the scriptural account, Joram allies himself with Judah and the king of Edom as well. These are two kingdoms to the south of Israel. Jehoshaphat was the king of Judah at this time, and Elisha the prophet meets them in the desert. And part of the story makes it sound like Elijah is probably already in heaven at this point in time, but Jehoshaphat is still on the throne, and so they could have just been in different locations, and I have not been able to figure that out and reconcile it in my own head. I just discovered this little thing yesterday. But in any case, Elisha is the one who intercepts them in the desert. And Moab ends up getting defeated in the desert. They push on into the heartland of Moab, and they hold off Israel at Kir Hareseth. And this actually all gets preserved in a different perspective, from the Moabite perspective, on a stele that they found in 1868. And so this is an authentic stone commemorating Moab holding off the northern kingdom of Israel. And this is an enormously important historical document because this is a monument that Mesha, the king of Moab himself, set up approximately 3,000 years ago. And it's still extant, partially at least. So the story with this particular stela is an Anglican priest or something came across it in Jordan, what is modern day Jordan. Back then it was part of the Ottoman Empire. And he was interested in it, and the Ottomans heard about it because they were ruling, and they wanted to get a hold of it and pass it on to the Germans. And the Bedouin tribesmen didn't like that because they didn't like the Ottomans ruling over them, and so they found it and they smashed it to pieces. Fortunately, the Anglican guy had taken a imprint of it, and so the imprint of it was preserved, so we know what was written on it. They found some of the fragments, which are the lighter colored ones up there. This is in the Louvre in Paris apparently right now.
Do you know how tall is that?
I don't know.
So the lighter pieces are original, the darker pieces are
Recreations.
recreation.
Oh, I was
But anyway,
wondering.
so the darker or lighter parts of that are 3,000 years old. This makes a mention to the house of Omri, and it makes mention of Mesha being the king of Moab and several other things. And what it does is it lends historical authenticity to the scriptural account of what is actually going on.
Hot diggity.
and it is known to be authentic from that time frame. When they found it, it was the oldest written document from the Moabites that they had ever come across, and so they could not have forged it because they didn't even know what a forgery would look like or sound like. And so it actually makes mention of the house of Omri, and it mentions how Omri had subjugated them, and that they were also subjugated to Ahab through his reign, but after Omri's son, doesn't mention him directly by name, when Omri's son dies, they threw off the yoke of Israel.
So essentially, it's a snapshot of that time.
Yep, it's a snapshot.
Yeah.
What that is a propaganda piece. Like if you read it, he's trying to spin a really close run fight that's described in the scriptures as a victory to the survivors of his people. Like, I led us down a path that almost exterminated our entire people, but a few of us are still alive and we don't have to pay taxes and tribute to the Israelites.
Oh my
And
gosh.
so this is a common thing that happened back in those days. And there's another one we'll get to in a few minutes here as well. But the Assyrians did this to a T. And what you would do is any military engagement, nobody was there wasn't anybody taking a smartphone video of it, and everybody who died is dead and they can't talk. And so you just convince the survivors, this is what happened, remember, right? And then you write this down, and everybody who wasn't there, that's the only account they have in the know of. And so
Easy.
this is a propaganda piece, and it's a well-known historical artifact and type, and so there's a lot of these from this, and this is where the scriptures start getting to be historically authenticated from known pieces of ancient stone.
Joseph
Right.
Goebbels would have appreciated that kind of propaganda.
Yeah, exactly. All right, moving on. We have Elisha the prophet. His ministry seems to follow Elijah's ministry. So you don't have to write all this stuff down about him. He prophesies for approximately 50 years based on the king who is reigning when he dies. It goes well into the next dynasty of the northern kingdom.
I'm trying to figure out where you are on the timeline. I just see his prophesying.
Yep,
Is that also in?
that whole stretch.
Oh, I see it.
Yep.
It says
So
that
you-
Elisha got a double portion of Elijah's spirit. What does that mean?
So if you count up the miracles that he produced, he did twice as many as Elijah.
Wow.
And so he heals bad water in a well, he curses the youth of Bethel, and they get mauled by she-bears.
Oh my gosh.
There's a ever-flowing oil, poison stew gets neutralized, he feeds 100 people with a mere 20 loaves. That actually, his ministry and the miracles he produces are very similar to what Jesus does
I
in the
was
New
gonna
Testament.
Say, that seems really familiar.
Yep. The feeding of the 100 is definitely foreshadowing something to come.
He cleaned up the stew.
Yep, Naaman gets healed of leprosy. He's commander of the king of Aram.
Maybe- Oh, I remember that
Yes.
story.
No one wants to eat.
I know.
Stew.
That would be like finding Putin's general and then making sure he gets healed of leprosy. Like,
Oh my gosh.
who's the enemy general? Well, okay.
It's like a Ukrainian.
Yep.
thing.
An axe how it floats. He assists in the wars of Aram to the point where the king of Aram is accusing his officers of rebelling against him and being treasonous. And they're all like, no, it's not us, trust me. It's this prophet Elisha. He tells the king of Israel, whatever you say in your bedchambers.
Yeah,
Oh my
that's,
gosh.
that's
Yep.
really freaky.
Samaria gets sieged while he's in Samaria. He prophesies the death of Ben-Hadad, who is the king of Aram, and that Hazael would become king. And then he sends to have Jehu anointed the king of Israel. And all of this seems like it takes place in the reign of Joram, the king of Israel. I'm not absolutely positive on that because the writer of 2 Kings seems to dive into everything Elisha, and then he comes back out to the annals of the kings, and not everything is precisely in sequence because you're dealing with this person and then you're dealing with this person, and then you're like, oh, I have to double back to get to this person because they were mentioned. And so some of Elisha's ministry events that are mentioned in this stretch may have been in the next dynasty that we talk about next week. But Jehu is that transitional figure that we'll talk about. Elisha was the one who's sent to have him anointed king.
You weren't kidding when you said it gets complex.
Yes. All right. That was the northern kingdom. We'll try to quickly get through the southern kingdom here. So the line of David continues. Still have the capital in Jerusalem. Jehoshaphat is a righteous king. He reigns 25 years. Became king at 35 years of age. And he has a son named Jehoram. This is the one who marries Athaliah. 3 years of his reign overlapped with his father Jehoshaphat. But he reigns from 892 to 885. And then after that, his son reigns for 2 years. His son becomes king at 22 years old. Which means that his father sired him at the age of 17. And Ahaziah was the youngest son of Jehoram. I don't know how all that works, but this is a common thing we'll find as we go through these kings of David's line. Alright, so the first one is Jehoshaphat. Like I mentioned, he was a righteous king. He removes all the high places and the Asherah poles that were in Judah, and he actually sends officials out to teach the law of Moses. And generally speaking, they had peace in the land of Judah through his reign. He
How
had
many years did he reign? 22 years?
25.
25.
Yep. His foreign policy changed dramatically from his father. His father Asa was almost always at war with the northern kingdom until Omri comes to the throne at least. And Jehoshaphat allies with Ahab by getting his son Jehoram married to Athaliah. And that happened sometime before 907 BC. Because that's when their youngest son was born. And Jehoshaphat overlaps with all of the kings of the north that we've covered here today. He fights against Aram with Ahab at the Battle of Ramoth Gilead in 897, where Ahab is killed. The very next year, he builds a fleet of trading ships with King Ahaziah. They work together at this project. It's based down at Ezion Geber, down on the shores of the Red Sea. And that fleet is wrecked, but that is reminiscent of trying to reestablish that trading fleet that Solomon had. And then when Joram is king, he is marching against Moab with Joram. And that's when Elisha prophesies that water will come. One independent war that Jehoshaphat fought. He is attacked by Moab, Ammon, and the Meunites all at once. And this is where his righteousness shines forth, and he has one good foreign policy win. He seeks the Lord, and the armies of Moab, Ammon, and the Meunites end up fighting each other and destroying each other out in the field, and Judah merely collects the plunder from the battle. And they didn't have to do any of the fighting. This is when they sent out the musicians in front of the army.
Play loud if
God,
I
I wanted
recall.
to be one of those musicians.
Yeah. No. I will stay away from the front lines of Ukraine myself. So his biggest mistake probably was marrying his son to Athaliah, because his son totally walks away from the righteous ways of Asa and Jehoshaphat. And the two of them together had led Israel righteously for 66 years at this point in time. And now it all gets thrown down the toilet with Jehoram. Because he walks in the ways of Ahab. So he's worshiping the Baals and the Asherahs just like Ahab was. He murders his 6 brothers, the other sons of Jehoshaphat, rebuilds the high places. So what Asa and Jehoshaphat got rid of, he builds back up. And everything goes south for the kingdom of Judah really fast. Edom rebels against them. They had been subjugated, and they threw off the yoke of Judah successfully. This was actually prophesied by Isaac when he was giving the blessing to Esau. You will serve your brother, but when you become restless, you will throw off his yoke. So a prophecy given in Genesis was fulfilled here in Jehoram's reign. He gets rebuked by Elijah the prophet as well. Philistines and Arabs come and attack Judah. They carry off his wives and most of his sons, and then he dies of a lingering disease of the bowels, just like Elijah foretold. And the thing that is so sad is that in the Chronicles account, it says that he died after suffering from this lingering disease of the bowels for 2 years, to no one's regret. Everybody was happy to see him die.
That doesn't sound like a good 2 years.
Yeah, it was a little more than 2 years, but it was not a good 8-ish years or whatever it was. His son Ahaziah also walks in the ways of Ahab, and he's only around long enough to die. He allies himself with Joram, the king of Israel, and this would be his uncle, who was the king at that time. They're fighting against Hazael, the king of Aram at Ramoth Gilead. And this battle goes well for Hazael, and is commemorated on this stela, which was set up in Dan, which the Arameans controlled at this point in history. So this is another propaganda piece. This one is really significant because that highlighted part in white there makes a reference to the house of David.
Oh, wow.
What's the language? Cuneiform?
Nope, that is a Proto-Aramaic script.
Okay.
So it is a little older than Hebrew that we have the Bible preserved into today, because that comes a few hundred years later. But all these letters are related to it, and some of them are going to be related to the Phoenician alphabet as well, because they're right in that neighborhood. So this is a piece that Hazael set up as another propaganda piece celebrating the victory over the house of David and the house of Israel. And the kings specifically are not preserved, but the reference to the house of David, when they discovered this in 1993, it sent shockwaves through the archaeological community, because the official line is that the house of David is just a mythical, legendary thing. He didn't really exist, and now all of a sudden they have written in stone from just 100 years later a reference to his descendants who were ruling Judah.
So they thought he was kind of like a King Arthur type deal.
King Arthur thing was what they always used to think, and all of a sudden they have, from that time frame, a reference to the kingdom of Judah ruled by the house of David, and there's a lot more
Can't click
credibility.
undo on that.
Nope, you can't.
It's right there.
So, there's not absolutely positive that this battle was from this one at Ramoth Gilead, but all the characters were in place, and this is what the consensus of the academic community is, that this is commemorating that battle with Ahaziah and Joram fighting against Hazael. And then to wrap up here tonight, this will be transitioning into next week. Jehu, the son of Jehoshaphat, not that Jehoshaphat, because this is the son of Nimshi, not the son of Asa, was a commander of Israel's army. He gets anointed king over Israel. He proceeds to kill Joram, the king of Israel, and Ahaziah, the king of Judah, and then he destroys the house of Ahab, fulfilling Elijah's prophecy that everyone who dies in the field will be eaten by the birds, and everyone who dies in the city, including Jezebel, his wife, will be eaten by the dogs.
Dogs.
So it's like fruit basket upset.
Yes, and you can see it on the timeline. It takes 7 years for Judah to come back to equilibrium, and the northern kingdom actually gets into its best, most prosperous and peaceful time eventually, but we will get to that next week. All right, sorry to hold you a little late here this evening. Does anybody have any questions as we wrap up? There was a lot. I'm not going to ask you to try and sort out the minute differences between Ahaziah's and Joram's or Jehoram's.
Was you going to be on the Kahoot?
I have no idea what I will put on the Kahoot next week.
You can be really mean.
I could be really mean. I'm not inclined to be nearly, so we'll try to pull out the more important key information from this.
Good job, Pastor. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Have a good week, everybody.
You too.
See you, Alex.
See ya.